Hey folks, my name is John Thompson. I'm the founder of Spring Framework Guru. So in this video, we are going to take a look at creating RESTful web services using Spring Boot. So we are going to be looking at Spring Boot 2 and Spring Framework 5. Inside of that, Spring Framework 5 actually introduced two web frameworks. One is Spring MVC, and then the other is WebFlux. In this video, we are going to be looking specifically at Spring MVC and the annotation controller style based of generating web services using Spring and Spring Boot. So we are going to be using Spring Boot to kind of jumpstart things a little bit for us. And I'm going to show you how we can rapidly build a web service, a very basic RESTful web service using these tool sets. So this web service that we're going to build, it's going to be backed by an H2 in-memory database, which we could easily swap out for any other relational database. Between that, we are going to be using Hibernate for the JPA provider. So JPA, Java Persistence API, that is the standard ORM tool for Java. So we're going to be utilizing that. And on top of that, I'm going to show you how to use Spring Data JPA for that. So that provides us a wrapper, a real handy wrapper. So all we have to do is declare our entity and then an interface using Spring Data JPA. And we have our persistent services built. So Spring Boot's going to take care of transactions and setting up the data source for us, initializing entity scan. So that is all handled by the framework. So there's a lot that we're not going to do, but it's provided for us through Spring Boot. And then finally, we are going to set up a REST controller. I'm going to show you how to set up several RESTful endpoints. And we are going to use JSON as our language. So primarily JSON, we're not going to be dealing with XML, just JSON in this example. But I'll show you how to get a list of objects back from the database. So we are going to make a full trip to the database and then render back JSON to the web client, both. And we'll show you how to get it by ID. And we'll even show you how to create new objects in the database using a post, HTTP post method. So we're going to cover a lot of ground on this. So this is a very introductory type level video for creating RESTful web services using Spring MVC. And this is all built around Spring Boot 2 and Spring 5. So a lot of really cool content. If you're not familiar with the Spring framework, this is a really good video to see how we can create, or how you can create, RESTful web services using Spring MVC. All right, in this video, we are going to take a look at creating RESTful web services using Spring Framework, and specifically Spring Framework 5, and we're going to look at using the MVC library within inside of Spring Framework 5. And this is kind of the traditional way of building web services with Spring Framework. And to do this, there's actually two different ways. We're going to use Spring Initializer to create the project. And there's two methods. I'm going to show you both of them. And the first method is to go over to start.spring.io. And this is a website that the Spring team has set up for us to rapidly create projects. And what's really nice about this is that it creates a set of curated dependencies using Spring Boot and a parent POM. If you go back 10 years ago before Spring Boot, well, actually Spring Boot's only a couple years ago, but 10 years ago when we were doing Spring applications, the mixture of dependencies was very tricky. So this is a huge step up for us as far as creating that initial project. So I'm going to go ahead and use a Maven project, and obviously we are going to be using Java. And here I am going to be using the new Spring Boot 2. And right now at the time of recording, we're on milestone 7. And this is supposed to be the final milestone before we go into release candidates. So right now they're still doing some integration with the different libraries of the Spring framework. But for what we're doing, this is going to be very stable. So I'm going to select that. And I'm not going to change the group ID or this, but I am going to switch over to the full version right here so we can see the different options. And you can see there's a lot going on here. But the first thing we want to do is grab the web. And we are going to play with Project Lombok. That's a really cool project that we can utilize. And don't get confused here. We're not going to be setting up a REST repository or web services. This option for web services here is specifically for SOAP web services, but we are going to be doing REST web services. And scroll down here, and we are going to be using JPA. And this is going to bring in Spring Data JPA, so that's some really cool stuff. And for our purposes, we are just going to be using the H2 database. So that's going to be an in-memory database. That's perfectly fine for our demonstration. I'm going to show you how to set things up with that. Being that we are doing RESTful web services, we don't need any template engines. And you can see there's a lot of options here, especially for cloud. We're not getting into the cloud stuff right now. You can see the stuff is read out, so it's not ready for Spring Boot 2, but we do want to bring in Spring Boot Actuator. We'll show you some cool stuff with that. So I'm going to go ahead and generate the project, and you can see here that we downloaded a zip file. And this is one way that we can generate this. So inside the zip file is going to be a completely configured project for us. So it's going to have stubs of a couple classes and then the Maven POM with all the dependencies in it. But what I'm going to do is show you how to do the same thing inside of IntelliJ. So let's come back over here to IntelliJ. And what I want to do is say new project. You can see that I have this new project dialog up. And you can see it's going against the URL of start.spring.io. And if you look at the Chrome, it's the same URL to start.spring.io. So IntelliJ is going over to the spring.io website and utilizing the Spring initializer right under the covers, but we can do everything right from inside of our IDE. Now, the first thing I want to do is come up here and select the latest Java version on my machine. That's 152. And I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. And I'm going to change the domain here. If you're new to Java development for packages and also groups, you always use the reverse domain name. So that prevents class conflicts. So long held tradition inside the Java community. And we'll just call the artifact Spring MVC REST since we will be using Spring MVC. And just go ahead and click on Next. And now you can see these options here. These options look a lot like what we saw on the web here. Notice all the same or similar options. We should have everything here. You can see the major like cloud discovery, circuit breaker, cloud messaging. So circuit breaker, cloud messaging, etc. are here. And these are the different categories that we can select from. So here we want to grab Project Lombok. SQL, so we want JPA and H2. And then down here on ops, we wanted to do actuator. And also, you can see up here the Spring Boot version. We want to get to the M7 version. So that's Spring Boot 2, which includes Spring Framework 5. At the time of recording, we are on M7. That's milestone 7 of Spring Boot 2. This is expected to be the final milestone before we go into the release candidates. So at the end of January 2018, they are expected to release RC1, which will be the first release candidate for Spring Boot 2. So let's go ahead and select this. The stuff inside of M7 is pretty stable. They're just resolving a few edge cases right now with some of the smaller libraries. But for our purposes, the stuff that we are working on is going to be pretty stable going forward. So I'm going to go ahead and say Next. And I'm just double checking Spring MVC REST. And I'm happy with where it's storing it on my machine. So I am going to click Finish. And right now, IntelliJ is going out there. It downloaded that zip file and it's unzipping it. And now it's mounting the project. You can see it down at the bottom of the screen. It's going through, it's indexing the project, downloading dependencies. And now we can see that everything has come up. And you can see here's the project structure that was created. And let's take a look at the Maven POM here. And you can see this is the data that I provided. So it's customized that Maven POM for us based on the data we provided and the setup. And what's important here that's really nice about using Spring Initializer is that we are going against the Spring Boot Starter parent project. And what this does for us is it brings down a set of curated dependencies. You notice here, none of the stuff in here is specifying version information. So that's all curated by Pivotal and the backers of Spring Framework. And now we're getting a set of dependencies that are going to work together. We're not missing anything, so we're going to get everything that we need. And before Spring Boot, setting all this stuff up was a huge headache, absolute huge headache, because it'd take you a day or so to go through, find all the dependencies, and then you get in there and like, oh, I'm missing this jar, or oh, I need this version. So this really alleviates a lot of headaches from the developer, because I remember starting off in the early days, and it was really kind of like the Wild West of trying to get the right mix. It would spend a half a day trying to get things set up. And down here on line 63, we can see that we have repositories, And this is because we are on the release candidates and milestones. So we need to include these as well as the snapshots for the plugins. So that is our Maven dependency. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. So we can see here's our project. I want to just take a look at the dependencies and show you what's happening here. So we have the Spring Boot Starter JPA, and this is actually bringing in Spring Boot Starter, AOP, JDBC, Hibernate. There's the H2 database, and what this is bringing in is a lot of different dependencies for us, and also the Spring Boot Starter actuator. We can see the various things that are bringing in. So we get a lot of dependencies right out of the box by bringing in these Spring Boot starters. And it also includes in here, we can see that it brought in the Spring Boot Starter test. And so right out of the box, we are going to get things like JUnit and Mockito and Hamcrest. So these are all very common libraries that we'd have to include manually if we were not using Spring Boot. So this is a real handy thing to start up. All right, going to collapse that panel. And let's come over here and expand out the source. Let's take a look at what was created for us. So we get the whole project structure created. And we can see that we have a standard Spring Boot application. And this is a special class here that this is going to be used to launch Spring Boot. So we have the Spring Boot application as saying run this class. So this class is actually a Spring Boot configuration class. So we can add in beans in here in configuration options. You'll see a lot of demonstrations of that. I'm not a big fan of that. I like to keep my configuration separate. I just think that's a little more tidy to do in your organization. But one thing that does trip up new people to Spring Boot is this class is going to do a component scan in this package and down. So if I were to create something, a Spring component and just guru.spring framework, this class would not pick it up. So I'd have to tell it to specifically look there. But everything that we're going to do today is going to be working from this package. So it's automatically going to pick that up. So we're going to get a lot of Spring Boot goodness, and a lot of people call it magic. But once you understand the broader Spring framework, it's taking care of a lot of stuff, making sensible defaults and sensible choices for things that you'd normally have to do anyways, but Spring Boot is going to provide that for us. So the first thing that we want to do for our demonstration is set up a domain class. So we're going to use JPA for this. So I'm going to come in here and create a new package and call that domain. And let's come in here and we'll just do a customer object. So nothing too fancy. I'm going to create a new Java class called customer. Now to make this a JPA class, we want to do, so we're bringing an entity out of the JavaX persistence. And let's give it an ID value. Do a first name, and now what I could use IntelliJ to generate the getters and setters and whatnot, but I'm going to show you a shortcut, and we are going to use Project Lombok, and we are going to annotate this with the data annotation. So what's going to happen here is, let's take a closer look at the data. So I'm doing a command click on data. So this is going to set up getters, setters, required args constructor, toStrings, and equal code. So Project Lombok it's an annotation processor, so it hooks into the Java compile process. It's going to create these classes for us. So this is going to set everything up for us so we don't have to generate all that boilerplate code. Project Lombok is going to do it just by annotating that class. So it's a real handy tool to use. If you are following along inside of IntelliJ, you want to come up here to project settings and go under build, compiler, annotation processors, and make sure that you have enable annotation processing clicked off, because IntelliJ may not be happy. I'm not an Eclipse user, but I believe there's something similar inside of Eclipse where you want to enable the annotation processing. And I'm pretty sure that there is a plugin for Project Lombok with Eclipse, but I am the wrong person about to ask for tips on Eclipse because I have not used Eclipse in a number of years. So I'm a big IntelliJ fan. I said adios to Eclipse a long time ago. So let's go ahead and move forward with this. And then the last thing we need to do is set up our JPA entity. So we're going to bring in the JavaX persistence annotation. So that's a generated value. And generation type identity. So that's going to set up the identity for us. and that is our JPA domain class. So now what we want to do is use Spring Data JPA, and to do that, we are going to come over here and do a new package. I'm just going to call it repositories. And this file is a repository model. That's how Spring Data JPA works. And what we're going to do is declare an interface this time. Now, you don't have to call it customer repository. That is by convention. You call it whatever you want. But remember, more people are going to be reading your code than writing code. So you want to be nice to the people behind you and follow some very common conventions. And one common convention is to use entity and then repository. And in this case, we are going to do an extend. We are going to extend out the JPA repository, and we are going to leverage Java generics. I'm going to say customer, and then the second property is going to be for the ID value. So this is the entity and then ID. And let's take a closer look at JPA repository. You can see here, this is the Spring Data JPA interface. And this is going to give us a number of options, and we're going to utilize this. So this really out of the box gives us basic functionality. And what happens is Spring Data JPA is going to provide us this class at runtime. So we are declaring the interface. I'm not going to get too far down the rabbit hole on Spring Data JPA, but the way it works is you declare the interface, and then it's going to provide the implementation, and we're going to be able to utilize that. Now, underneath the covers, Spring Data JPA is going to take care of all the mapping commands of working with the database through Hibernate. So that's completely abstracted through us, so we are going to be able to use just the ORM. It is an absolute huge time saver for us. So let's go ahead and move on with that. And another good design pattern here. So now we have our domain and our repository. What we like to do here is also create up a service layer. So I'm going to create a new package called service. And let's come in here and create a customer service. And let's do that as an interface. Now let's go ahead and declare what we want. So we want, I got to go ahead and import that. So we want a method in there to find the customer by ID. And let's also get a list of customers. I'm not going to pass anything in on that, but now we'll have two methods here where we can find a customer by an ID or find all customers. Now let's come in here, and I'm going to do an alt enter, and IntelliJ is giving me an option to implement the interface. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And this is a Java convention. So we've created an interface, and typically you are going to do IMPL. That is a pretty common Java convention. Now, some people don't like using IMPL. If you only have one, that's perfectly fine. But if you had others, like here, I might be doing a JPA impl, but I could also be doing a MongoDB impl. So I could have different persistent stores that I'm going against and abstract it from my controller layer. But in this case, we are just going to be running against JPA. So I'm just creating a very simple implementation of it. So let's go ahead and move forward with this. IntelliJ is going to set that up. Now let's go ahead and work on the implementation of this. So the first thing is we're going to want to get a handle on that repository for us. So let's come in here. And I'm declaring a final variable. And I'm going to generate a constructor for that. And we are going to pass in the customer's repository. So the only way that we can instantiate this class is to inject in a custom repository. And it looks like I have a typo in repository, my mistake there. So let's go ahead and work on the implementation of this. So we are going to return back a customer. So pretty simple implementation here. And then also here, we're just going to return back a full list. Now, I'm not showing you some of the options as far as like paging and sorting. We are just doing two very simple implementations here. And this will set up our data layer. And let's go ahead Now we are going to be backing it with an H2 database, so our database isn't going to have anything inside of it. So let's go ahead and work on setting up that database. And a real common design pattern with the Spring framework is to use an H2 database, and you want to initialize it with data. So we have a very handy way to do that. And the Grails guys used to call it Bootstrap. They used to have a Bootstrap class for this. So let's go ahead and create a new package here. And I'm just calling it Bootstrap. I'm going to create a Java class. And we'll just call it Bootstrap Data. And if you're not familiar, Bootstrap is from similar to booting up a computer system. And it's from American slang where there's a saying of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So kind of getting yourself up in the morning by your bootstraps. So this is a kind of an initialization routine, and we are going to use a Spring Boot specific class. So there's a couple different ways to initialize data. Here, we are going to do this through Spring Boot. You can do a pure Spring way by tapping into application events, but Spring Boot does have a couple options for us. We are going to implement command line runner, and we'll make this a component. So the Spring context will pick it up. You can see that IntelliJ is saying that's a red line. So let's go ahead and implement methods. So it takes in this run. So now the class is happy, but we want to initialize data. So remember in our customer service implementation, so we brought in the customer repository. So I am going to copy that over. So remember, cut and paste is bad. So don't be doing cut and paste. Let's go ahead and do that. And Control N for constructor, and allow IntelliJ to do it. And if you're familiar with Spring, notice I'm not doing an auto wire here. So in Spring, I think it was 4.3, as long as you have required args constructor and just one constructor, the Spring is going to go ahead and auto wire that for us. So let's fix this customer repository name here. So come in here to refactor, rename. We'll fix that little typo there that's starting to bug me. So you can see that IntelliJ did go in and redo that. So for this, we'll regenerate the property name. And so now what we want to do is create a new customer. I'm going to pause the video while I type this out. I don't think you need to watch me set up Pojos. Okay, I've jumped ahead a little bit and fleshed out creating some customer objects. So you can see there on line 25, I start creating 3 new customer objects. So no big mystery there. You can see Michael Weston, Sam Axe, and Fiona Glenann. I'm not sure if Glenann is spelled correctly or not, but if you watch any of my videos, you know that I am a fan of Burn Notice. So these are the characters out of Burn Notice. So we're going to use them as our test customers in this example. But anyways, on line 25, 30, and 35, I'm creating new customer objects. And then you can see on 28, 33, and 38, I am saving those using the Spring Data repository interface. Now you can see that it's been set up there. And I come into the class on line 23. I am doing a system output of loading customer data. And then you can see down here, I'm saying that we loaded X number of customers. So let's go ahead and run this right now. So I'm going to go ahead and run the Spring Boot REST application. IntelliJ brings that up by default. So let's go ahead and start that up. And I just want to make sure that we are getting that output. See that Spring Boot does start up. You can see the chatter from Hibernate. You can see I made one small mistake here. So it started and stopped. So nothing's really going on here. And there's a very simple explanation for that. So if we look at the Maven POM, I have the actuator JPA H2, but I forgot to bring in the Spring Boot Starter Web. So let's go ahead and rectify that now. And we can see that there's several different options here. Web Reactive, Web Flux, and Web. We just want the web, and that brings in this traditional Spring MVC. So let's bring that in, and we'll tell IntelliJ to import the changes. And what this is, let's examine that a little closer. See where it got nested under. There it is. I had to do a refresh. So Spring Boot Starter Web is there. And this bring in a couple different starters. So we get JSON, Tomcat, that's the important one, also Spring MVC. But the way Spring Boot is going to be working, especially at Spring MVC, is it brings in an embedded Tomcat servlet container. And Tomcat wasn't there on the class path, so Spring Boot didn't configure it. So we started up and shut down right away. So let's go ahead and run this again, and we'll see a much different result. So we'll see it start up and then stay running because we are running inside a servlet container. Now we can see there's additional chatter there in the log files. We can see that it set up some endpoints for us. And then we can see that it also loaded customer data. So we did bring in Spring Boot Actuator. So we do have a web application running right now, even though we have not defined a controller. Spring Boot Actuator does give us some endpoints. We can see here that I'm clicking on the health, and we can see that it's bringing up an application. We are seeing that the database is alive and we are good on disk space. So these are different health indicators available for us through Spring Boot Actuator. If I was writing like Rabbit MQ, we'd see metrics on Rabbit. If I had other options in there, there's a number of different options that we can add to the health endpoint. So this is a very rudimentary application. But the real nice thing about having Spring Boot Actuator installed is it does give you a health check endpoint. So if we needed to monitor that application with some type of enterprise tool to make sure that it's alive, this is an endpoint that we could utilize. So now we do have our application up and running. I am going to shut it down for right now. And let's go ahead and collapse the Maven. So basically, we've set up our backend persistent store. We have a service that will respond to it, but what we have not done yet is we have not created the controller. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to come in here and create a new package. And you might have guessed I might call it controllers. Now, some people prefer to call this endpoints. Not necessarily wrong. Controllers isn't necessarily wrong. It's a personal preference. So now I'm going to create a customer controller. Now, what we want to do here is Spring MVC has an annotation called REST controller. And this annotation, I believe, is also available inside of Spring WebFlex, but that is the reactive stack for web applications, which we are not addressing today. So this designates this class as a REST controller. So now the first thing that we want to do is get a hold of our service. So now let's go ahead and do. So that's our customer service installation. I can do Command N for constructor, and that's going to set up our class. So now by annotating this as a REST controller and providing this constructor, what this is saying is it's a Spring component. So REST controller is a Spring stereotype. So this is going to get wired up as a Spring bean, and Spring, when it creates this class, it's automatically going to inject in an instance of our customer service. And I'm getting a little red squiggly there, so let's double check something. And I actually did make a mistake here. So this actually needs to be annotated with service. So that is another Spring stereotype. So now Spring is going to manage this component also as a Spring bean. And let's come back over to our controller. And now you can see that little squiggly went away. So now that is available there. And now let's go ahead and set up our first mapping. So we return back a list of customers. So pretty simple implementation. Getting a little red line there because I forgot the return statement. So this is going to be the method that we are going to use for our customers. But we want to make this a little more interesting because there's no mapping to it. So we've set up our Spring object at this point, but we have not done anything to set up the URL mapping. So that's what we need to tackle right now. So this is an annotation for GET mapping. So for GET requests coming to the controller, we are going to invoke this method, but we have not provided any URL mapping. Now, one thing I do like to do is come up here and do public, and we'll call this a string. So very good habit in development is the don't repeat yourself principle. So the base URL for this API is something that's going to be utilizing a lot throughout it. Now, some people like to externalize this into a properties file so it can be overridden at runtime. I personally think declaring a static final string is ideal for this because that string isn't going to change, and chances are this URL value is probably not going to change. If it's something that's going to be changing in different environments, you have to externalize it, but here, this is perfectly fine to do. So now this sets up our string for the URL that we want to be utilizing. And let's go ahead and map this. So we do that with the request mapping annotation. And by doing this, we are setting up for every method on this, we are declaring that this base URL is going to be utilized. So any request coming in, this base URL is going to be invoked. Now, I do have the option if I want to do something more complex, I could do request mapping on the method level. But here, what I'm saying is when I get a get request to API/v1/customers, I'm going to invoke this method here. So let's go ahead and test this now. I'm going to go ahead and run the application. Now let's go up here and we can see right here that has been mapped. So this is the debug output from Spring MVC. So we have mapped API v1 customers to method get on that method of the controller. Now let's jump over to Postman. That's a handy tool for testing web requests. And let's go over here to API v1. And I'm going to go ahead and say send that. And now we can see that I did in fact get a list of customers. So we can see the ID value, first name, last name, Michael Weston, Sam Axon, Fiona Glenann. So that is our pretty simple object model from the customer. So that is a list of that. But what if we wanted to get a customer by ID? So I'd like to be able to come in here and do, let's get Fiona. She's far cuter than Michael anyways. So let's do that. And now Fiona isn't found because this has not been mapped yet. So let's come back over here to IntelliJ and implement that method. So a pretty simple method that we are implementing here. So we want to return back customer service, find by ID, and we're going to pass in that ID value. Now that's a pretty simple implementation, but we need to set this up a little bit. So as far as how we want this to behave, so let's do get mapping. And now what we want to do is come in here and do /squiggly ID. So this is telling Spring to look for the ID value in the URL. So this is setting that up. And get mapping is kind of like a hybrid of annotation. So it includes request mapping. So I could have done a get mapping and request mapping, but it's a little cleaner to do it this way, just with the ID value there. You'll see examples of both where they use a request mapping and get mapping, or just request mapping and specify that as a parameter inside of the annotation for request mapping. So there's a couple different methods that you can see out there. Get mapping, the different annotations were added to, I want to say Spring 4.2, maybe 4.1. I could be a little bit wrong on that. But now what we need to do here is we set up this path variable, but we have not done anything here. So what we want to do is come in here and say at path variable. And now what this is doing, it's telling Spring, and this is by convention because I'm using the ID value. So that's the name of the method parameter, and it's going to match this. So that is a convention. So as long as I do the squiggly ID and have a method property called ID, now I could have 2 or 3 of these with different names, obviously, as far as path variables. So you can get a pretty long list of path variables in there. So you're not limited that as long as they have unique names. Spring is going to handle that. So that's the way it's working as far as ID. So now what this is saying is when we come in here and we have a value, So API v1 customers slash and an ID value. We are going to parse out that ID value out of the URL and take it from a string to a long and pass that into our find customer by ID and then return back that customer object. So let's go ahead and, because I'm not running Spring Boot dev tools right now, I am going to have to bounce Spring Boot for those changes to take effect. And again, while this is starting up, we are recycling the container. We are going to bring back up the H2 database, and we are going to insert data again from our Bootstrap class. So very handy thing that we're doing here. So let's go ahead and toggle over to Postman now. And we'll do a send on that. And we got an internal server error. Let's see what happened there. So it looks like we turned back a null type. Let's take a quick look here. No, we did not. Okay, I took a closer look at this error, and this is kind of a weird one, and this was my mistake. And let's come back over here and take a look at the implementation. So we are getting a lazy initialization error, and this was a mistake in my implementation. Come over here to service implementation. So I did a get one. So if I come in here and take a look at that, this is returning back a reference. And by that, it's a little bit different. So this is a pretty technical difference. So I am doing a get one, which turns back a reference, and that is not what I want, because that reference needs to exist inside of the Hibernate context. So Hibernate does a lot of lazy initialization, which is really cool. So things aren't pulled out of the database until they're needed. So in this case, that's what's happening in this case, but I'm getting outside of the Hibernate context. And that's bad because we don't want that. But I do want to get that object, and the proper thing to do, and this is a mistake on my part when I wrote this, is rather than get one, I want to do find by ID. And that's going to return back an optional, and I'm just going to say get. So that was my mistake there. And this is a change inside of Spring Data. So Spring Data prior to Spring 5 would return back just the object, and rather than an optional, so that I'm going to do something bad here and just say get. So that is bad, and IntelliJ is giving me a warning, but this is just for demonstration purposes. And the more recent versions of Spring Data, they are returning back the optional. So you do have to work with the Java 8 optional class, which is a very good thing to do. And I do expand upon this in my courses. But for here, let's go ahead and work with that. And I'm going to go ahead and reinitialize this. So we'll restart Spring Boot, and we'll come up with a fresh database and get our code change in there. And we can see we are back up and running. Let's toggle back over to Postman. And now if I come in here and do this, I was actually running in the debugger. Come back over here, we can see that Fiona Glennon is returned properly. Now, one more thing that I want to show you is how to create a new object. So we'll go ahead and create a customer. So let's jump back over to IntelliJ now, and we will implement that. So first thing, I'm going to work backwards this time. So let's go to the customer controller. And actually, I'm going to stop this. We don't need that running right now. And we'll stop him. So I'm at the customer controller. So let's go ahead and implement that at the controller level, and I'll work backwards. So we're going to create a method that's going to take in a customer object, and we want to return back customer service, save customer, and that'll take in the customer object. And let's go ahead and decorate this now before we do the implementation of that method. So what I want to do is a post mapping. So remember, in our RESTful APIs, to create a resource, it's going to be through a post. And now I'm going to show you one additional annotation here, because our post mapping, we want that to return back a HTTP created status. So we are going to use the response status annotation. And there it is down at the bottom. So that sets that up to return back that. So, and what this is saying, so when I do a post against API v1 customers of a customer object, we are going to call customer service to save customer, which we have not implemented yet. And we are going to return back a new customer object, or the persisted one. So let's go ahead and implement that. And I'm hitting Option Enter, and I'm going to go ahead and create that method. You can see that IntelliJ automatically added that for us. And let's go ahead and implement methods. And in this case, what we want to do is customer repository, save customer. So it's going to save that new customer entity for us. So you can see how easy it is working with Spring Data JPA to go ahead and persist that. So let's go ahead and start this, and we'll test that out. So I'm going to bring this up normally. Now we are up and running, and we have 3 customers. And let's go ahead and copy this. And now what we want to do is a post. I'm going to paste in that JSON, and we don't want that ID value. And I can't remember Jesse's last name from Burn Notice. Call it Jesse someone. I really don't remember his name. I remember Jesse, but I don't remember his last name. So now we're going to post this object. So we have first name, last name, and this is a JSON object. So we're going to do a post against this endpoint. So let's go ahead and send that now. And we can see that it did not bind properly. So we got first name, last name, and null. And let's go ahead over here and do a get on that. And these null properties are here because I made a very simple mistake. So what's happening is I did do the post against that, and it did return back the ID value. But what happened here is if I come back over here to my controller, take a look at this. I passed in a customer, but what happened was I didn't tell it to bind it, the request body. So now with the request body annotation, that is going to tell Spring MVC to bind it. And underneath the covers, what Spring is doing, it does wire in the Jackson JSON library, and it's going to do all the marshaling and unmarshaling for us kind of seamlessly through the framework. So let's go ahead and try this again. I bet it's going to work a lot better this time. So come back over to Postman. We'll go ahead and use Jesse again. And again, I'm going to do a post against localhost 8080 API v1 customers, which is the API that we mapped. And we are doing a post, so let's go ahead and do that. And we need to set the content type. And now I forgot to set this content type in Postman. Now we can see that ID for Jesse someone was created. So now let's come back over here, and you can see this is where that's persisted from the time that I did not have the request body annotation on the method. So let's go ahead and send that again. And now we can see that is there. Come back over here. Summon DD. Now if we come back over here to 5, we can see that that data is in fact persisting. Okay, let's jump back over to IntelliJ right now. And I'm not going to implement the remainder of the request methods, but let's go ahead and recap what we did here. So let me stop this so we can get the screen back. Shut that down. So first we went in and created the customer entity. So this is a standard JPA entity. No big mystery here. So this is using JPA, and with Spring Boot and the way we're configured, we are using the Hibernate implementation of JPA underneath the covers. Spring Boot does bring that in and configures it automatically for us. The next thing we went in is we went in and created the JPA repository, and this is out of the Spring Data JPA project, which gives us a very robust tool set as far as working with JPA entities. Now, I only scratched on the surface of the capabilities of Spring Data JPA. It's a very robust project, and here I'm just demonstrating a very, very simple application. Now, the next thing is we went in and created our Bootstrap class. And Bootstrap Data, this class is going to run because it implements the interface command line runner. Command line runner is a Spring Boot interface that basically says run me on startup. So that's what this is going to do. It is a Spring component. So what happens is the Spring context comes up, injects in a customer repository. Again, that's Spring Data JPA, and Spring Data JPA is providing us the runtime of that because we only provided the interface in our configuration. So Spring Data JPA is going to provide us the implementation at runtime. That gets injected into this class, which gives us our persistence operations. That's getting persisted to an H2 in-memory database. That's the way we are configured because we brought in H2. And Spring Boot is providing us all the auto configuration for working with Spring H2 database. So if you notice, we did not set up a data source. That is being provided by Spring Boot for H2. So this sets up and it creates our initial set of data for us. And then finally, we went over here and created our REST controller. The REST controller sets up the mapping, then the request mapping, and I did use a public static final string so I don't repeat myself when I need to use this string value again. And here we are injecting in a customer service implementation, and it's a pretty common pattern here to create a service, like a service wrapper, over your Spring Data repositories. Now, I do have examples out there where I just work with the repository directly, but here, let's take a quick look at the implementation of that. The service implementation is for working with the repositories, and in a real business application, typically you are going to have your web logic in the controller and any additional business logic here inside of the service layer. So the service layer is where you want to be implementing that business logic, not inside your controllers. I've seen this principle really abused where doing crazy things inside of customer controllers, like obtaining database connections and everything inside a controller, and talk about violating the single responsibility principle. Very, very bad practices. But here we have a very simple application. I'm just trying to show you a few best practices along the way of using the implementation of a customer or a service layer. So that service layer is going to be a wrapper around our persistence layer, which in this case is the Spring Data repositories. So let's come back over here to the customer controller. I have mapped out 3 different paths on this controller, or URLs. So everything is utilizing the base URL of API v1 customers. And when you're dealing with RESTful APIs, a lot of times you're going to see an API v1 and then a v2 and v3. As that API evolves, you'll change the version to allow clients to use the old version, then switch over to the new version when they're ready. Now here, like I said, we have 3 implementations. If you just do a get against that URL, we are going to get a list. If you do a get with an ID value, we are going to return back an entity with that ID from that query. And then finally, I set up a post mapping so that we can post JSON to that endpoint, that URL value. So in this case, I am posting that, and you can see on line 37, I initially forgot to do request body there, but that request body annotation says, look at the request body and parse out what's there. In this case, we are expecting to see a customer object in the form of JSON posted against that endpoint, and we are going to parse that into a Java object using Jackson underneath the covers. And again, Spring Boot is configuring everything for us. So that happens through the framework. That gets parsed from JSON to a POJO, a customer POJO, and then we pass that POJO into our service layer, and of course, that goes to Spring Data JPA, Hibernate, gets persisted to the database through JPA/Hibernate, and then we return back the object to our client. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. We did cover quite a bit of ground, and I wasn't able to go in depth as I would like to on some of these subjects. If you are interested, check out my course. I do have a very large course, a very popular course on Spring Framework 5 on Udemy, and that is available, where I do explore these topics in a lot more depth, where I can get into this in a lot more depth. But this is a great overview. I hope you really got a lot of benefit out of this. You can see how quickly you can utilize the tooling of the Spring Framework and leverage the framework to really deliver a lot of great functionality quickly. Once you become comfortable with this, you can really knock out a lot of business functionality. And this is why, this is just an example why that the Spring Framework is so popular in the enterprise today. A lot of companies are adopting the Spring Framework because developers have a great tool set to rapidly develop enterprise class software.